Now, I'm with the Responsible Nature Management Center of the Institute of Geography of RAS, and I'm presenting on behalf of Evgeny Schwartz, the head of the center, and myself.
Если говорить о некой, что ли, практическом применении вот этого накопленного в наших...
As regards the practical application,
можно сказать, богатства, да, в виде большого количества
of the riches contained in Russian forests, in terms obviously of carbon sequestration, according to the Ministry of the Environment and many other groups, it should actually grow.
The
number to grow to like 1.2 billion, which is a pretty striking number. But the big question is actually different. The big question is, how can we actually capitalize on it? How can we put it to good use? If indeed we get to monetizing it, we would love the money to go to better land use and better forest management practices. There have been lots of different maps showing the current state of Russian forests, and we actually see that, in some areas, forests happen to be sources of CO2 rather than CO2 sinks, obviously because of forest fires. And this is something that needs to be taken into account as we do our planning. Now, let me very briefly touch on the subject of monetization, quote unquote. One would include, for example, sale of national quotas. And this is something that the Paris Agreement provides for. However, we don't think it's really going to happen. Well, because, the right to trade these quotas is reserved for the countries who actually are reducing their emissions, while Russia has been increasing its emissions since roughly 2000. So the state obviously will not be able to monetize it. Unless some new guidelines for this system are proposed. Alternatively, emission reduction units can be sold as part of forestry projects. There have been 2 projects completed in Russia under the Kyoto Protocol. One was in Altai, the other was in Bekin. It may very well be that such deals will actually be supported by the Paris Agreement. But it will take at least 3 to 4 years. It has already been mentioned that there is this experiment in Sakhalin underway. We don't know, however, when a market where such emission reduction quotas could be traded will actually be launched. Another important factor includes cross-border carbon adjustment mechanisms, which would certainly motivate lots of non-forestry, non-LULUCF companies to buy those quotas. There are also national systems for trade in such quotas, but little can be said about them at the moment. Obviously, forestry projects are effectively the main tool for such developments. And according to KPMG research, the potential of such projects can account for up to 45% of all the savings, so to speak, deliverable in terms of sequestration. we're talking about 360 to 420 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This is not just about forestry. I mean, it also covers, say, pulp and paper industry level projects. And also, please note that it's not the, say, 625 billion tons, or I'm sorry, million, or 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. It is monetizable. It's only the amount above the baseline. And determining this baseline is still a stumbling block. And there is one more element of such projects, which is their registration, validation, certification, and annual monitoring, which obviously will have costs associated with them. What kind of projects like this can happen in the Russian Federation? Obviously, some of them may be around voluntary forest preservation by the leaseholders. This was the case, for example, in Bikin. The company would actually choose to preserve more forest than they had to. And ideally, it should be combined with better firefighting prevention. I'm sorry, with better fire prevention and firefighting practices. Well, the second project, and there is currently some discussion happening in Russia regarding to what extent they've properly taken into account carbon sequestration at the soil level, but we still believe projects like this have a certain future. I'm referring to projects of intensive land use and reforestation. So some companies in Russia are now switching to this intensive model of forest management. This model focuses on now let me put it differently. With the modes that they propose, you actually need to do fewer clear cuts per unit of timber you produce. By actually doing more improvements cutting, and effectively it's pretty similar to Finnish or Swedish models. And finally, some projects can be useful in terms of protective afforestation. And anti-erosive and field protecting afforestation projects. I actually believe that projects like this can have payback periods of 15 to 20 years, which may frighten lots of investors. I guess that should be it for my speech, unless you have questions.